Lynn, I mean, all I'll say to begin with is, you know, the introduction.
Yeah.
And then I'll say over to you.
Okay.
Like that.
Perfect.
And then you'll take it over for the whole of the participation, and then we'll go on to Q&A after that.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
So you won't be interrupted at all.
No, that's
we're live now, David. So whenever you're ready.
So we've got anyone in there?
Yeah, we've got 44 connections, and we've got a few on YouTube.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Shall we start? Oh, we're a bit late, aren't we? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Tonight we welcome author Lynn Julius to HOA United. When we think of the persecution of Jews, we turn historically to Europe and Russia, ending at the Holocaust. However, our speaker tonight is talking about North Africa and the Middle East, where over 1 million Jews lived. The daughter of Jewish refugees from Iraq, Lynn Julius is a journalist, blogger, and founder of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Her work has appeared in newspapers around the world. She has written a book called Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. Her first book, and it was published in 2018. A Norwegian and Portuguese translation have been produced, and it's now being translated into Arabic. Lynn will be giving a presentation that will bring up lots of questions, so please don't try to ask any questions during the talk, but afterwards please ask as many as you want. You can raise, you can write your questions in the chat room or click the hand in participants area, but please don't wave as we won't see you. So Lynn, please take it over.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you to Edgeware for inviting me here tonight. As David explained, I've published a book about two years ago called Uprooted, and it was published by Valentine Mitchell, which is a British publisher specializing in Jewish books. And it's since been translated into Norwegian, as he said, and into Portuguese. And an Arabic translation is now underway. Why did I write this book? Well, first of all, we have to go back about 15 years to the founding of my organization, Harif, which is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. The association was founded really because we live in a basically Ashkenazi community, and Sephardim and Mizrahim really are a small minority in this community. And I felt that not enough was known about the Sephardim and the Mizrahim. And so Harif was set up really to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews. And alongside Harif, I started blogging. I started collecting information about Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. And this blog is called Point of No Return. And it's been going for 15 years. And every day I try and find something interesting on the net, and I post it on the blog, or I put up some original, ideas of my own. Anyway, so the book actually grew out of this blog. The other reason why I wrote it is my own family background. As David mentioned, my parents arrived in this country as refugees from Baghdad, Iraq in 1950. While I was growing up, even though I was born in this country, the story of the Iraqi Jews really haunted me, as I still had relatives living in Baghdad, including my 4 grandparents and several aunts and cousins. In fact, I had one aunt who'd moved to the UK with her family. She was a young widow. And in the early 60s, she decided to go back to Iraq and sell some property, thinking it would take her only a few weeks or maybe a month, and then she'd be able to rejoin her family in London. As it turned out, she was trapped in Iraq and not allowed to leave for 6 years. And my parents had to look after her children. In 1967, as you know, there was the Six-Day War, which was a fantastic victory for Israel, but it was a terrible defeat for the Arab countries. And the regime in Iraq began to take its revenge on the 3,000 Jews or so that were still left in Iraq out of an original community of about 150,000. Now, most of those, in fact, 90% of them had gone to Israel, and only 3,000 Jews were left. Now, the regime in Iraq started cutting off telephone lines. It sacked Jews from their jobs. It wouldn't allow Jews to study at university. It froze their bank accounts. And then it started accusing the Jews of spying for Israel. And there was a show trial in January 1969. 9 Jews were hanged in the public square in Baghdad. I don't know if any of you remember that terrible episode. There were 14 people altogether, but 9 of them Jews. And 500,000 Iraqis came to sing and dance under the bodies. And that was just the beginning of the terror experienced by the remnant Jewish community, because about 50 Jews were picked up off the streets, jailed, and never seen again. And to this day, we don't know what happened to them. The aunt I was telling you about managed to get out of the country. She was smuggled out along with about 2,000 other Jews. They had to leave illegally in the dead of night, disguised as Arabs with one suitcase as if they were going on holiday. And they were smuggled out by the Kurds and with Israel's help. They were smuggled over the border into Iran, which seems unbelievable nowadays, was then friendly to Israel. So that was basically why I, the whole story of the Jews from Iraq was very personal to me. So I will now try and share my screen. Oops. Does that work? Yeah. I hope you can see a picture of the book there. Yeah, great. So this is the book, Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight, available from Amazon. Whoops, sorry. Just going a bit further forward. Sorry, I need to go back. Oops, sorry. Right. Okay, so the main focus of my book is the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Now, this is a bigger number than Palestinians who left Israel, and it's also the largest number of non-Muslim refugees to leave their homes in the Middle East up until 2003, when there was a massive exodus of Christians from Iraq, and their numbers went down from about 1.5 million to about 200,000 today. Now, why are they important? Well, Jews have always been a minority in terms of the total Jewish population in the world. I mean, Jews in Arab countries were only about 10% of the total in 1948. But obviously after the Holocaust, they became a much bigger percentage of the total. And today, over 50% of the Jewish population of Israel is composed of either Jewish refugees or their descendants from Arab and Muslim countries. So obviously, this is hugely important for an understanding of the Middle East conflict, and also for any prospect of peace, because the claims of these refugees and the interests of these refugees will have to be taken into account in an eventual settlement. Now, I don't talk about Iran very much in my book, because for the simple reason that the big exodus really was from Arab countries, and it took place immediately after 1948, whereas the exodus from Iran only took place about 30 years later when the Ayatollahs took over in 1979. But even there, the Jewish population of Iran has gone down dramatically from 100,000 to about 8,000 today. Right, so what geographic area are we talking about exactly? Well, we're talking about 10 Arab countries, from Morocco in the far west to Yemen at the very tip of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula there, the Arabian Peninsula. There is some confusion over terminology. Are we talking about Sephardim? Are we talking about Mizrahim? There isn't really a satisfactory term to describe them. I would go for Eastern Sephardim as opposed to Western Sephardim, who might have sought refuge in Europe after the Spanish Inquisition. But of course, Eastern Sephardim is not that satisfactory because Morocco is to the west of most of Western Europe. So what do you call Jews from there? So anyway, bear with me. I do use Sephardim, I do use Mizrahim more or less interchangeably, but the term is not really satisfactory. So the Jewish population was about 1 million in 1948, but today it is barely 4,000 in Arab countries. And in fact, if you look at this chart here, you will see that the decline in the Jewish population in Arab states was actually even more dramatic than the decline of the Jewish population in Europe. But of course, it did not have the same tragic consequences. It did not end in genocide, and most Jews did survive their escape from the Arab world. Although it has to be said that hundreds did die in violence, in rioting in Arab countries. So just to give you an idea of the figures now, this chart shows you the numbers in 1948. You can see that these countries had hundreds of thousands of Jews or tens of thousands of Jews. And today you can count the numbers on the fingers of one or two hands. And in some cases, there are no Jews at all. For instance, in Algeria and in Libya, in Iraq, there are now only 4 Jews. And to all intents and purposes, a lot of these communities are now extinct, except perhaps in Morocco, where there's still a functioning community, in Tunisia, There's a functioning community in Tunis and in Jerba, and in Iran there are still functioning synagogues, and the community is still alive, just about. The other thing you notice is the date that these communities were established. They go back to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century before the Christian era. And in the case of the community of Iraq, goes back to the 6th century before the Christian era. And these communities predate Islam and the Arab conquest by 1,000 years or more. The Iraqi Jewish community goes back to biblical times. That's 2,600 years ago, the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. He took Jews as slaves, as captives from Jerusalem, and he took them to Babylon. And that's where that is the origin of the community, which stayed in continuous existence for all those years. And even today, the Iraqi Jewish community don't refer to themselves as the Iraqi Jewish community. They call themselves the Jews of Babylon. And if we ever get to travel again, I recommend a museum just outside Tel Aviv, which you might like to visit, called the Museum of the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center. So the Middle East really has almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. And there are 17 biblical figures actually buried in the region, and 5 biblical prophets. And one of these prophets was the prophet Ezekiel, who was actually taken to present-day Iraq with the captives. And this is his shrine, which is situated about 2 hours south of Baghdad. It was a very popular site of pilgrimage when there was a Jewish community in Iraq, and about 5,000 Jews would visit Ezekiel's tomb, usually at the time of Shavuot, and also between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And on the left, you see the scribes who would write down prayers or blessings for the visiting pilgrims. And on the right-hand side, you can see a fragment of the Hebrew inscriptions that adorn the actual burial chamber of the tomb of Ezekiel. But if you look at the picture below, you can see that the site has been absolutely, completely transformed into something else. It's been transformed into a Shiite shrine, a huge construction. And the original Jewish shrine is really just a very small part of this huge complex. And of course, Ezekiel has been more or less superseded by Muslim holy figures. And if a Jew were to turn up to this place and ask to visit the shrine of Ezekiel, he probably wouldn't be allowed in, because this is a holy place to Muslims, and beside which the Shiites have a prejudice against Jews. They consider them unclean or untouchable, so they would certainly not allow a Jew into this place. And the distressing thing about this is the construction really took place in the last 5 years, and there hasn't been the slightest outcry. UNESCO hasn't said anything. Very little interest has been really raised by what's been happening here. And actually what's happened to the Shrine of Ezekiel is really a metaphor for what's happened to Jewish heritage in general in this region. Synagogues have been converted to mosques or to shops or to gyms or sports clubs, or they've been allowed to crumble to dust. And roads have been constructed over cemeteries, or they've been vandalized. And, there is actually very little left of 2,000 years of Jewish presence in these countries. There is one exception to this, and that is in Morocco, where the king actually has been very diligent about investing and investing his money into preserving Jewish sites, Jewish quarters, synagogues, and cemeteries. But in Morocco, the Jewish population there has dwindled to 1% of what it used to be. And one can perhaps envisage that the community might be extinct in a generation or two. And also you have to bear in mind, if you're being a bit cynical, that the Moroccan king has a motive for spending all this money, and that is tourism is very important to Morocco. It's the second biggest currency earner. And so perhaps that explains why he's been so generous. So what was the relationship between Jews and Muslims during the 13th or 14th centuries that they lived side by side? Well, I think there is a confusion between symbiosis and coexistence here. A lot of people talk about Jews and Muslims, living in harmony together. But I think what they mean is there was a cultural symbiosis. The religions are very close, Judaism and Islam. The languages are very close, Hebrew and Arabic. And of course, because the Jews had been there for such a very long time, they influenced the environment, and the environment in turn influenced them. But that's not the same as coexistence, which presupposes an equality in the relationship. And that didn't really exist because Jews and Christians were considered dhimmi. That is to say, they were inferior to the Muslims, and they had to be reminded of the fact because they were a subjugated minority. They had to conform to certain humiliations. They had to wear special clothing. They did not have the same legal rights as the Muslims. And above all, they had to pay a tax, the jizya tax. And this meant that they had to subcontract their right to self-defense to the ruler of the day. And the ruler would protect them. But you may ask yourself, protect them from what? And it was not uncommon for Jews to be the subject of rioting or looting. There were sporadic outbreaks of violence. There were forced conversions, and life was really very precarious for these Jews. And even though some rulers were better than others, some rulers disregarded the dhimmi strictures altogether, others applied them to the letter. You could never really be sure, of your status, and certainly you couldn't be sure what the future would have in store for you. So I will just read you a short passage from my book to illustrate the dhimmi status. In a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks. One such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700, refused to put up with the humiliations suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the seventh step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. Nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. Turks, Arabs, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Haim Fahi. But like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Fahi had his nose and ear cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So, as I say, things could be very good for the Jews under one ruler, and they could be just as bad, they could be bad under the next ruler. So all this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century when there was a sort of social revolution. The Western powers were trying to increase their influence in the Middle East and North Africa, and they started insisting that the Jews and the Christians be given equal rights with the Muslims. So in 1856, the dhimmi status was actually abrogated in the Ottoman Empire. But where the Ottomans did not have control, the dhimmi status actually endured for a lot longer. So in Morocco, it was still in force in 1912, and the dhimmi status endured in Yemen, and also well into the 20th century, and also in Persia, or present-day Iran, till 1925. But alongside the increase in the influence of the colonial powers, a group of well-meaning French Jews decided to set up a network of schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And their objective really was to educate these communities, mainly in Arab and Muslim countries, so that the Jews would be equipped with the skills to survive and even thrive in the modern world. And they would also be able to defend themselves and stand up for their rights. And this was actually such a success that a middle class began to emerge, and the whole social structure became inverted. So instead of being inferior to the Muslims, the Jews found themselves getting the best jobs. And because they were more educated and the Muslims were being left behind, when the colonial powers set up their mandates and their protectorates, the Jews were in a very good position to become the backbone of the colonial administrations. So you found that they became dominant in trade, in commerce, in banking, and a lot of them, became very comfortable. They moved out of the Jewish quarters. They had nice houses and servants, and they had good jobs. And this was really a golden era that lasted from, the early 20th century right up until the 1940s. And often when you ask Jews who were born in Arab countries, what was it like? They will look back with nostalgia at this golden age, and they will say, oh, we lived very well, it was paradise, the food tasted better, and all this sort of thing. But in fact, the golden age was actually quite brief. There was also a golden age in the arts. Jews were very prominent in music. For instance, in Iraq, practically all the musicians were Jewish. Out of 250 instrumentalists in the Baghdad radio orchestra, only 3 were Muslim, the rest were Jewish. This is not because the Jews were any better at playing music. It was because an imam had issued a ban on Muslims learning or playing music. And the story is told that one day the Iraqi prime minister switched on the radio in the 1940s, and it was Yom Kippur. And of course, the Jews did not play on that day. And he was so upset that he heard silence on the radio that he determined to set up an orchestra that would play when he wanted to hear it. And then in other fields, the Jews were also prominent. On the front cover of my book, I have Lillian Levy-Cohen. Her stage name was Camellia. She was a young Jewish actress in Egypt. Egypt was then the Hollywood of the Middle East. And she made about 18 films in the space of about 3 years. But sadly, she was killed in a plane crash. And people said at the time that she was King Farouk of Egypt's mistress, and that he kind of engineered the plane crash to get her out of the way. The lady in the bottom left-hand corner is Leila Mourad, who was extremely famous in Egypt. In fact, her songs are still played today, and her films are shown. And most Arabs do not know that Leila Mourad was actually Jewish. And the other picture shows you a famous Jewish singer from Algeria. But this golden age was in fact very short. As I say, it really ended in the 1940s. And it was brought to an end really by the rise of anti-Semitism. Now, this anti-Semitism took several forms. One form was colonial anti-Semitism. Here you see a picture of an anti-Semitic pamphlet that was written by Edouard Drumont. Now, Edouard Drumont was actually the member of parliament for Algiers. Algeria at the time was considered part of metropolitan France. And Edouard Drumont was an avowed anti-Semite. He actually led the campaign against Dreyfus, Captain Dreyfus, who was accused of betraying France. But Algeria had quite a substantial population of white settlers, called the Pieds Noirs, and many of those were anti-Semitic. And the reason why they were anti-Semitic was because the Jews in Algeria had actually been given French citizenship in 1870. But the white settlers resented the Jews because they didn't think they deserved the French citizenship. And in fact, the white settlers did incite riots towards the end of the 19th century against the Jews in Algeria. And I think it is fair to say that the colonial powers, while they were very happy to exploit the Jews for their talents, their skills, their languages, and I should really mention that the Alliance schools educated girls for the first time, but these very well-educated Jews, I mean, the colonial powers did exploit them for what they could get out of them, but they were not always very happy to defend Jews in times of trouble. And so there's several instances where anti-Jewish riots might have broken out, and the powers of the colonial powers or the forces of law and order took hours to turn up and quell the disturbances. And of course, I'm thinking of one particular example, but there are several. One particular example, the Farhud, which was the great massacre of Jews in June 1941 in Iraq. 2 days of rioting in which 179 Jews lost their lives. And the British Army were actually at the gates of Baghdad, and they could easily have intervened to stop the killing, but they didn't, because that meant interfering in the internal affairs of the country. And of course, the greatest example of betrayal, I think, by the colonial powers is what happened during World War II, when the pro-Nazi Vichy governments were established in North Africa. And they began to really implement the first stages of the final solution by stripping the Jews of their rights. And had it not been for the Allied victory against Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, the Jews of North Africa would have shared the same sorry fate as the Jews of Europe. There was another type of anti-Semitism that arose in the 1930s as Arab nationalist parties were set up. And these Arab nationalist parties were sort of blood and soil parties that wanted to achieve independence for Arab states, for Arab countries, but really they wanted to exclude minorities. And anyone who was not Arab, and eventually anyone who was not Muslim, were sort of marginalized and ushered towards the exit. And here you see the emblem of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. It may well remind you of something. And certainly the Syrian Social Nationalist Party actually still exists today in Lebanon and in Syria, and it was influenced by Nazism. And of course, the Ba'ath Party, which still exists today, and President Assad of Syria is the head of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, that was also influenced by Nazism. There was another form of anti-Semitism that emerged in the 1930s, and that was the anti-Semitism of Islamism. Now, we hear a lot about Islamism today, Islamic State or Daesh, ISIL, ISIS, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, all these parties but actually they are all offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was set up in 1928 in Egypt by the gentleman in the fez, Hassan al-Banna. Now, I would argue that anti-Semitism was really at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy, because even though tension was then building between Jews and Muslims, or Jews and Arabs in Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood hated the Jews because they represented everything that they abhorred. And that was, the Jews represented modernity, they represented women's rights, they represented minority rights and civil rights. And the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to turn the clock back and re-establish the caliphate. They wanted Jews to revert to their former status as dhimmis. And they started agitating against the Jews in Egypt in the 1930s and the Copts. They identified the Jews with the hated colonial powers, because obviously the British were in charge in Egypt at the time. And also at this time, they absorbed certain anti-Semitic ideas from Europe. They assimilated the idea that Jews had power and they wanted to dominate the world, and they were the source of evil, and they had to be fought at all costs. Now, the Germans, and here you see a picture of Fritz Grobber, who was the German ambassador in Iraq at the time. They were busy financing the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood. And towards the end of the 1930s, they decided that it was probably a very good idea to encourage the Arabs to rise up against the British and the French colonial powers. There was, of course, the small matter of the fact the Arabs were not considered Aryans. In fact, they were considered Untermenschen, but all that was kind of modified. I think they excised the offending parts of Mein Kampf, attacking the Arabs, and of course the Arabs became party to an alliance with the Germans towards the end of the 1930s. The third member of this alliance was, of course, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem. And he was an anti-Semite before he was ever an anti-Zionist. And what he did was he combined sort of traditional prejudice in the Quran against the Jews, anti-Jewish verses, with this new form of anti-Semitism inspired by European anti-Semitism and Nazi anti-Semitism. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was translated into Arabic and widely circulated. And of course, Mein Kampf was translated into Arabic and serialized in Arabic newspapers. And incidentally, the Germans also financed the activities of the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Arab revolt that broke out in 1936. Now, the Mufti was sent into exile in 1939, and he spent 2 years in Iraq, where he never ceased trying to overthrow the pro-British government there. Eventually, he and a group of pro-Nazis succeeded. They established their government in April 1941. The government was short-lived. The British went to war against this pro-Nazi government. They finally put the Mufti and his acolytes to flight, but not before they had incited this terrible riot I mentioned before, the Farhud, which broke out in June 1941. with hundreds of Jews killed, much looting, rape, and a terrible, terrible, disastrous event in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq. Now, the Mufti fled to Berlin, where he was a guest of the Nazis for the rest of the war. And he spent the war broadcasting virulent anti-Jewish propaganda. And here he is at his famous meeting in November 1941. Now, one of his objectives in meeting Hitler was to ask his permission to manage the extermination of the Jews, not just in Palestine, but across the Arab world. And I would argue that this is proof that he didn't just want a pragmatic alliance with the Germans to get rid of the British and the French. He was prepared to go the whole hog and exterminate every last Jew in the region, if and when the Nazis emerged victorious in World War II, as he was convinced they would. The Mufti also set up Muslim SS divisions, and in the bottom picture you see soldiers at prayer. This was in Albania and in Bosnia. And there is this myth that the Holocaust did not affect Jews in Arab countries, but it is a myth. In fact, Tunisia came under direct Nazi rule from November 1942. And here you see in the top picture, Jews being marched off to forced labor camps with their picks and their shovels. And the bottom picture shows you Jews from Libya. And here they are returning to Libya. They had been deported to concentration camps in Europe. In fact, hundreds of them were sent to Bergen-Belsen. Now, while most of them did survive, obviously not all of them did, they were Jews actually of British nationality, and you can perhaps just see the Union Jack scrawled in chalk on the side of the railway carriage. Now, Libyan Jews actually had a very bad time during the war. There was a lot of bombing going on, and they suffered a great deal. There was also a terrible labor camp, which was just set up in Libya, and that was the camp of Jador. 2,000 Libyan Jews were sent to that camp, and about 600 of them died of starvation or typhus. And there were labor and punishment camps in Morocco. This is not very well known. Political prisoners and soldiers of the defeated French army and European Jews were sent to these camps. There were also Jews, Moroccan Jews of British and French nationality who ended up in these camps. Some of the conditions were absolutely atrocious. And obviously, some of the inmates did die. So the big question is, what came first? Anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? There is a myth that before the establishment of Israel, Jews and Arabs did live in great harmony, and Israel really is to blame for, the relationship going wrong. But if you look at this picture, you can see the aftermath of a riot in Fez in 1912, well before the establishment of Israel. And in fact, if you look at the historical record, Morocco has possibly more pogroms than anywhere else in the Arab world. And I think if you consider the plight of other minorities, not just Jews, in the Middle East, for instance, the Copts and the Assyrians and the Yazidis, all these minorities have suffered. The Armenians, of course, in the First World War. All these minorities have suffered, and yet they do not have an Israel of their own. So this, I think, points to a certain dysfunction, perhaps in Arab Muslim society, an inability to tolerate anyone who is different. So fast forward to 1948, Israel is declared, and 7 Arab League countries declare war against it. And at the same time, they declare war against their own Jewish citizens. They bring in anti-Jewish legislation, treating their Jewish citizens as the minority of Palestine. So effectively, the Jews become enemy aliens. There's a whole host of discriminatory legislation brought in, designed to strip the Jews of their rights. But above all, these Arab states criminalize Zionism. And the question is, how do you define Zionism? Is wearing a wristwatch, is that Zionism? Because a lot of Jews were perhaps more affluent and could afford a wristwatch, and they were accused of sending secret signals to the Zionists. And Jews, because Zionism became a crime, Jews could be arrested, they could be tried, and they could even be executed for Zionism. At the same time, violence broke out in several Arab countries. Pressure built up amongst the Jews who wanted nothing more than to leave, but they were hostages to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Eventually, the pressure became so great that Israel reached a deal with several Arab countries and mounted rescue missions to airlift these Jews to Israel. And here you see pictures of Yemenite Jews who actually, they're a very observant community. And when the first plane arrived to take them to Israel, they boarded without fear, even though they'd never seen an aircraft before, because they had read in the previous week's parashah, God's words, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And they thought this is the plane taking them, picking them up. God sent them the plane which will take them to Israel. Now, Iraqi Jews were not allowed to leave until 1950, when the Iraqi government decided to allow emigration, but the price they paid was to be stripped of their Iraqi citizenship. And this document was issued to Iraqi Jews. On the left-hand side, you can see a stamp which says in Arabic, one way, no return. So these Jews were effectively being expelled because they had no way of going back to the country. And in fact, an even more dramatic expulsion took place in 1956, when 25,000 Jews had to leave Egypt. And in fact, these Jews left everything behind. It was a question of mass dispossession. And in Egypt, there was a wealthy class of Jews, some very wealthy Jews, This is a house that belonged to the Zuckerman family, and it is now the Swiss embassy in Cairo. And in fact, it is astonishing that so many embassies in Egypt were formerly Jewish homes. For instance, the home of the Russian ambassador, the Pakistani embassy, the South Korean embassy, the German embassy, the Saudi Arabian embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Dutch embassy. And I'll tell you a little story. There was a family called the Castro family who were very wealthy. And they, of course, had to leave after 1956. And Mrs. Castro was in New York, and she went to hear Jahan Sadat, the wife of the widow of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, give a lecture in New York. And after the lecture was over, Mrs. Castro went up to her and congratulated her. "Oh, that was a wonderful lecture. You know, I'm from Egypt too." And Jahan Sadat said, "Oh, wow, that's amazing. You know, you must come back to Egypt and show it to your children. Beti Betak, which means my house is your house." And it was literally.
Lynn, I don't know whether you realise, but it's nearly 9 o'clock, or it's 9 o'clock.
Okay, yes,
So,
I'm nearly finished. I'm nearly
oh,
finished.
great. Okay.
Yeah.
Questions. I know there's a lot of questions.
Okay. So now I'll just gallop through the rest of it. So this is Tahrir Square, and listed on the right-hand side are all the former Jewish properties around the square. Now, what happened to these Jews? Well, 650,000 out of 850,000 went to Israel, doubling the Jewish population of Israel virtually overnight. Israel was then a very poor developing country, didn't have the homes and the jobs or even the food for these people. So it put them in tent camps or mabarot. And some of these tent camps lasted for a decade or more and gradually turned into towns, like, for instance, Sderot started life as a tent camp. And here you see an invitation to a wedding. This is a couple from Iraq, and they're inviting their guests to the wedding in hut number 10. Now, the question is, why was this story neglected? It certainly was neglected in Israel, and this artwork shows you how few pages in an Israeli school textbook were devoted to teaching the history and the heritage of Jews from Arab countries. So I will just leave you with this with this thought, and that is, the Jews are not extraneous to the Middle East. In fact, they are one of the indigenous peoples of the Middle East. In fact, you know, to survive in this inhospitable region, you really need your own sovereign state and the power to defend it. And unlike the Kurds, for instance, the Jews have been lucky enough to achieve this. But this shouldn't really be seen as they shouldn't be seen as an anomaly, because the Middle East is not just a place where Arabs should exercise political rights. It's a rich patchwork of all different groups and tribes and religions. And some of these indigenous peoples are entitled to their own states. And so we're very lucky that the Jews have achieved their own state in Israel. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I am very happy to take questions now, David.
Okay, that was.
Sorry if I went on for too long.
You must be exhausted. We do have somebody in the audience who was actually a survivor of Libya. I don't know, but do you want to say anything?
Hello, Evelyn. Yes, Evelyn. Yeah.
Was that yes, Elia?
Sorry, I said Evelyn Habib. No?
No, I was going to say Beryl McNaught.
Oh, Beryl
Who
McNudgy.
would you like me to unmute, David?
If anybody wishes to speak, if you could raise your virtual hand, please, so that we know that your
Virtual. Elliot, you've
virtual
got
hand,
to,
you need to go through participants to do so. If you click on participants, you come to your name and raise your virtual hand. Please don't raise, if anybody's raising your hand up, we can't see you because we're on speaker view. So
Okay, I can see Jane.
I've got Beryl McNargy, or
it's actually not Beryl.
if you want to,
Elliot.
well, if he wants to unmute himself, I'm asking you to unmute, Elia.
No.
No, he's not.
You know how to do it.
I'm asking Victor Hudlin to unmute. Victor, you're on.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk again. Almost as good as the one you gave in Liverpool.
Oh, right. Yes, I gave the same talk, didn't I?
Yes.
Yes.
My question to you is, obviously, you've explained to us the rich history of Jewish communities in Arab lands. Are there any monuments, any recognition, it obviously but different from country to country, that there was a Jewish heritage, and which countries are encouraging these landmarks to be erected or talked about or educated in any schooling?
Yes. Well, Morocco has actually, as I said, preserved its Jewish heritage, and there's an awful lot of talk about it. And recently they made a TV program actually about Jewish culture, and they are making quite an effort to preserve their Jewish heritage. The problem is, how can you preserve your Jewish heritage without having any Jews? You know, and you end up with empty buildings, you know, which are basically monuments, as you say, but they, you know, they're not living, you know, examples of a living community, you know, and I think Egypt has tried to follow this course too. I don't know if you heard that the synagogue in Alexandria was recently restored, but no Jews were allowed at the inauguration. In fact, the Jews had to organize their own inauguration. And the Ministry of Tourism was there, the Ministry of Antiquities was represented, and it was quite obvious that they weren't interested in having real Jews at the inauguration of a synagogue. So this was purely a publicity stunt for the purposes of really encouraging tourism, I think. And this is the danger, that there isn't really any desire to encourage Jews to sort of really lead lead a Jewish life in these countries. I think things have begun to change, and the recent Abraham Accord, you know, signed with the United Arab Emirates is very interesting, because they are really making an effort to show that they're a pluralistic society. There's a fledgling Jewish community there, and there's a rabbi. In fact, there are 3 rabbis for about 100 people. But it's really quite an encouraging sign, because I think they're right. They need to show that they are, you know, that they are a genuinely pluralistic society and a tolerant society. And I think that is more important than restoring old buildings. Yeah.
Thank you. Elia McNargy, if you wish to unmute yourself. No, he doesn't wish to. Jane Myers, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Lynn. I'm holding a copy of the Jewish Chronic, or the Jewish News from January, where it said Libya needs her Jews as much as they need her.
Yes.
The return of the Libyan Jews is in the country's national strategic and security interest. I wondered if you had some thoughts about that, because as somebody who lived there up to 2 years old and had, you know, family and you know, community there, I would love the opportunity of going and seeing where my dad grew up and where I spent the early years of my life there. But what are the chances?
Yeah, but would you actually?
Can I come in on that?
Elliot, are you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can now, yes.
Sorry, yeah. Apropos this gentleman, this article in the Jewish News, I've actually been in touch with him, and he's very, very sweet, really. He actually wrote back calling me a brother, and I have been in touch with a number of people in Libya now on email, etc. And it's fascinating that you have to understand that the majority of the North African so-called Arabs, in fact, the original population of North Africa were Berbers. Yeah. And the Arabs actually came in from Arabia and occupied it and forcefully converted them. And this guy actually admitted that the majority of people in Libya are of Berbers origin, and the Jews preceded even them because they go back to the Roman times, etc. And it's fascinating how things are actually changing, and who knows? I mean, I don't want to advertise anything, but I'm in the middle of writing a book, and he even suggested. He even suggested I might translate it in Arabic. It's fascinating. So we live in interesting times. By the way, Lynn, I did speak at a Harif meeting in the West End.
Yes, I remember you had quite an exciting story to tell, actually, a very dramatic story. And I wish you luck with your book. Now, this guy, yes, it's all very heartening that he published this article, you know, let the Jews return. But I mean, return to what? The country is torn apart by tribal warfare. You know, there isn't law and order. There are no sort of, you know, what rights do people have in that place? You know, let them get their house in order first before asking for the Jews to return. But my attitude is these articles, okay, they're all very well. Usually they're written by one man. They don't represent, you know, popular opinion. And also they're always talking about, oh, we need the Jews, you know, because they can contribute to society. They're wonderful, you know, our economy will be sorted out and everything. But they never actually say what they can give the Jews back. You know, like, well, what's in it for them? You're nodding, Jane. Yeah, so, I mean, let them get their house in order. You know, let them guarantee freedom of religion, you know, let them guarantee security, you know, for their own people, let alone minorities. You know, obviously we would love to be able to visit these places. You, Jane, would love to go and see where your father was born. But how many of us would actually want to go and live there, you know?
Are there any other questions? Because it's getting reasonably. I have Alan Martin.
No,
you're not supposed to put your hand up.
No, there are no other questions.
No, Jerry seems to want to ask a big. Jerry must press the participants.
I can't
see you.
No, there are no hands at the moment.
Yeah, Alan Martin has. Alan, you've got to press the button in participants. It says raise hands. And Jerry, do the same if you want to be heard.
Can I just say something which actually I meant to say during my talk, but I kind of rushed it a little bit. It's all right. Somebody has raised his hand. Alan Martin? Yeah.
Yes, he's now unmuted as well. Alan.
Hello, Lynn.
Hello.
Beautiful.
There.
So interesting. I'd like to ask a related question. You've had Assad in Syria and he's still there, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya. And there's a particular mindset with the Arab countries that these type of dictators are the ones that are able to control the tribes. And when they're no longer there, there seems to be carnage, and the West have a totally different mindset and seem to be unable to control the tribes. And I just wondered, I know it's not exactly related, I just wondered what your opinion is of the best way for all this to move forward, and that to allow the Jews one day to return, what type of leadership needs to be in place in these countries to ensure some type of safety?
That is a very good question. I mean, we actually had a Zoom event on minorities in the Middle East. And I'm not sure there is an easy answer to this. I think certainly they have to have, I mean, they are tribes with flags, as you say. It's very tribal. We've had civil war raging in Syria, 500,000 dead. You know, these states are all failed states. And I think we're very far from having seeing any way out of this, really. I don't know what the solution is. Obviously, education, people say education, they need to be more tolerant. They need to have constitutions that, enshrine minority rights. But if the culture's not there, if there isn't a sort of democratic and tolerant culture, then there is no future for, for pluralism and this sort of thing. And you say for Jews to return. I don't think Jews are going to return. They might return to visit, but this is a complete myth. Like my children are not going to go back to Iraq. And anyway, my husband's Ashkenazi, so I don't think they'll want to. But obviously, people need to have a culture of tolerance, I think, and they're very far from acquiring that.
Thank you so much.
I think we opened a can of worms when the West decided that because democracy works for us, it would be the best thing in the Middle East. And clearly it wasn't. And
you say that, David, but look at Israel. The people in Israel have no democratic tradition. Most of them come from dictatorships. The Russian Jews never knew democracy. The Jews in Arab countries never knew democracy. So
there's a large swathe of people in Israel who are from Europe who understand democracy and have benefited from that. But I think on the side of education, it takes so much time. And I'm not sure that the establishments in many of those Arab countries necessarily have the infrastructure to educate the people at the rates to change things, certainly in the near future. We have another question from Morris. If you could unmute yourself. You need to press the button. There you are, you're on.
Yeah, no, Jerry just below me says that he wanted to ask a question, but he doesn't know how to attract your attention.
Okay. What's his... Doesn't make it easy.
Yes.
Right. Okay, I found someone called Jerry. I'll bring him in. I'm asking him to unmute. If you would like to unmute yourself, Jerry, wherever you might be.
Okay, he's unmuted.
Can you hear me, David?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Lynn, thank you very much for a fascinating, interesting, but even more so educational talk. So little is known by the Ashkenazim about what actually took place, and thank you. And I hope that your book educates so many. There is a beautiful poem, very deep emotional poem, which I'm sure you know only too well, which describes the horrors of the Fahad. And I belong to actually a Sephardi shul where my president, Rafi Cohen, has been honored by the King of Morocco, so that's quite a wonderful thing, as his position as the consul to Israel for Andalusia. And his relationship and the ensuing relationship for our community has been enhanced by that wonderful relationship. But thank you once again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I must just say one thing, and then I want to go on to something that I really shouldn't do, but I'm going to do it anyway. The first thing is that one of the things that I noticed is that Syria has got virtually no Jews, which it always had really until the Israeli war and soon afterwards. And we've got a lady coming here in a few weeks' time, and you should come and listen to her. She's actually a Canadian woman, and she virtually single-handed, this is in the early 70s, she managed to get over 3,000 Syrian Jews out of Syria, mostly into Israel. And if you think about it, that was wars were going on, there were civil wars. I mean, it was just incredible. And
Judy Feldkar. You mean Judy Feldkar?
Oh, you know her.
Yes. Well, we actually had an event with her, Harif event. And
really?
it was very successful. And yeah, she's a very interesting lady. Yeah.
I'll give you the date.
David, could you tweak your microphone? You sound like you are submerged beneath the bath at the moment.
I can't. Right, I think we should call it coming to an end now. It's quite late. But there's something I want to do that it only lasts a couple of minutes. Now, behind Lynn's right-hand shoulder, you can see a book. It's her book, Uprooted. And I just want to read out some reviews, and you can make up your own minds about what people have said. The first one was, hold on a second, Matty Friedman, and he said, Uprooted is a superb resource for anybody interested in a complex and often overlooked story that is crucial to understanding Israel and the Middle East. Uprooted is highly recommended for my many reasons, personal stories, analysis, and numbers that are otherwise hard to come by. The next one is Baroness Ruth Beach, and she said, Lynn Julius has historical account of the fate of Jewish indigenous inhabitants of the Middle East faced on record one of the gravest injustices of modern and past times. Uprooted is a devastating story. To read it is to understand why there is no easy solution to the Palestine-Israel question, let alone one state. This history shows why those who want peace so hard to trust their neighbours. It is a true perspective on the Middle East today. Then I've got somebody from America, F. Clapper, the Jewish Link, one of the best books to come out in 2018. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but
your sound is terrible, David. So it's bubbling through.
Okay.
Yeah. Can
okay.
I just say thank
but
you
we got the gist of that, and we understand it's a fantastic book anyway, and
Thank
extremely interesting.
Thank you, but it's not enough because we need to get the story out there. As you say, the Ashkenazim need to know what happened, and this is not just a Sephardi story. This is a Jewish story, and in the same way as we mark the Holocaust or what happened then. I mean, I'm not remotely trying to compare what happened with the Mizrahi Jews, but the Mizrahi Jews have to be included in the Jewish story, and I think we can all do our bit. I know Spencer Nathan, your deputy, has actually marked the 30th of November, which is the day to commemorate the Jewish exodus from Arab countries. He's done several events, and I think this should continue. And you shouldn't be the only synagogue doing this. There should be, every school, every synagogue, every community should be doing this. It's not just a matter of reading my book, even though that would be lovely.
As I mentioned to you before, I'd had discussions with Carol Basri back in, I believe it was 2005 when she was here, and she was talking to Parliament at the time, and Louise Ellman and John Mann were extremely interested in the subject matter, which is the understanding of refugees from the Arab lands. Obviously, at the time, they were saying that Iran wasn't part of that because the Iranians don't regard themselves as Arabs. But obviously, it was all the other countries that they were relating to. And I know that Carol has been working extremely hard over the years, and just to get recognition for the refugees, as opposed to just for one generation, as opposed to, and refugee status ultimately is only supposed to be one generation, yet the Palestinians have managed to have refugee status ranging from 3 to 4 generations, and they are the only peoples ever to have achieved that. And of course, the Jews never actually sought refugee status at the time because they immersed themselves in the country to which they went to, whether it be Israel or America or Britain or France or wherever it might have been. They immersed themselves. They wanted to make good for themselves and be part of the nation and make good for their family. But it's obviously latterly to get involved. And obviously it's an extremely interesting subject. And I thank you. And I know that as we've been on for an hour and a half, I know David wanted to bring you in for about an hour. But on his behalf, and I'll do it, and I'm sure he won't mind because his sound is abysmal. However much he has a wonderful voice and he looks great, but he doesn't sound too good at the moment, following through bubbles. But I'd just like to thank you for being with us this evening and bringing this interesting subject to us and educating the many people who've been on here this evening. I thank you for that. And I thank everybody else who has been with us this evening. And if I could just mention that next week we have Councillor Caroline Stock with us, who is the Mayor of Barnet. And no doubt you will have many questions. I can assure you it is not a council meeting, and she does have the authority. So if you could, if you would like to be with us next week, please, it should be an entertaining evening. We have many questions, obviously many local issues. But I come back and I'd just like to say thank you very much, Lynn, for being with us this evening. It's greatly appreciated. And I'm sure everybody else that we're now looking, if everybody could show their hands in support and the applause to thank you for that.
We've had a few messages in the chat thanking you, Lynn, as well, that'll come back to me. So
thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, I will close the live stream now, and we will keep the Zoom open for a few more minutes if anyone wants to say anything. So live stream's now ended. Okay.